Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn. Coming up later in the programme, the Lib Dem conference is underway. We ask the new leader, Vince Cable, how he plans to win back support in the capital. Joining me for the duration of the show, Theresa Villiers, Conservative MP for Chipping Barnet, Sir Ed Davey, Liberal Democrat MP for Kingston and Surbiton, and Neil Coyle, Labour MP for Bermondsey and Old Southwark. Welcome to all of you. I want to start with the official inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire, in which it is feared more than 80 people died. Here's Jerry Thomas on the remit of the inquiry, which opened on Thursday, and the questions it seeks to answer.
The former Court of Appeal judge, Sir Martin Morbick, who heads the inquiry, said he would not shrink away from making recommendations that could lead to civil or criminal prosecution. But he rejected calls for a survivor to be appointed to the inquiry panel, as it would risk undermining impartiality. The full terms of reference for the public inquiry, which have been accepted in full by the Prime Minister, are the cause and spread of the fire, the design of Grenfell Tower, the adequacy of the regulations relating to high-rise buildings, whether the relevant guidance was complied with, the actions of the local authority before the tragedy, and the response of the London Fire Brigade. An interim report is expected by Easter.
Theresa Villiers, do you have confidence in the inquiry?
I do. I think it is hugely important that we get to the bottom of what caused this fire and do everything we can to ensure that something like this never happens again. That's why I think a public inquiry was essential.
Why shouldn't survivors be appointed to the inquiry panel?
The inquiry, what we have to ensure is that the inquiry operates effectively, it reports in a timely manner, and that it approaches things in a very objective way. So I'm convinced that it will listen to survivors, will work closely with them, but I think it needs to be run by the tribunal chair in an objective way.
And so they shouldn't be part of the panel in that way. Did you agree, Neil Coyle, with your colleagues, Emma Dent-Coad, who is the local MP, and David Lammy, about the criticisms of Sir Martin Morbick, who is leading this inquiry? Or do you now think it is time to push on?
Well, I mean, they've set out the terms of the inquiry, and I personally think the survivors should be more involved. But I think beyond that, there is much more that needs to be done. The government is still not talking to local authorities about how to retrofit sprinklers in other high-rises. Southwark has 174 and does not know to this day what support will be available from government to prevent something like this happening elsewhere. Right.
I mean, a BBC investigation which focused on half the UK's council and housing association-owned tower blocks found just 2% have full sprinkler systems. Is that acceptable?
Well, one of the reasons why it's vital that we have an interim report is so that we understand as much as possible about what has gone wrong, so we can remedy these matters effectively now. But I know the government is already working with local authorities on immediate safety measures.
Now, the recommendations that come out of this inquiry, there will be recommendations, and Martin Morbick, although cannot pursue criminal investigations, has said that he will be able to find out who is accountable and in part to blame for what went wrong at the Grenfell Tower. But when we look at other inquiries into cases like the Lakanal House inquiry, recommendations were not followed by governments. How can we ensure that they are this time?
We've got to put a huge amount of pressure on the government, both before the inquiry concludes. We need governments to say they will accept the recommendations.
Yeah, but they've done that, right. But how do you bind them?
Well, we need votes in Parliament, and one of the best things at the moment in an awful tragedy is we can hold this government to account because they don't have a majority. And I can assure you that Liberal Democrats will be working with Labour colleagues and others to make sure ministers do have to bring these recommendations in.
Right, but it's not just on this government's watch, is it? Because actually some of the recommendations to do with fire safety came under Labour governments who also didn't follow through in terms of improving fire safety regulations.
Well, and you know, if the inquiry finds that the Labour government's at fault, then then you know that is the case. But what's more important is there are thousands and thousands of families out there who live in buildings who are worried, who are not seeing the government act, not seeing the government put resources in, so they can't set up a fund to help with Grenfell and London Bridge in my constituency and the Finsbury Park major incidents over the summer. But the government still hasn't put its hand in its pocket and isn't working with Southwark Council in an effective way to make sure that the resources
I do agree
are put in
that
place.
social housing is got to be on the agenda, both for fire regulations, for safety
But
and
it's
investment.
not part of the remit of this inquiry.
No, but it follows from that. The debate that's been opened up by Grenfell, yes, is about fire regulation, yes, is about safety, but it's also about the whole attitude to social housing and tenants in social housing, which in some councils is frankly scandalous.
Right, does that need to change?
I think, well, in response to Neil's point, I would emphasise if Southwark don't think that they're getting the resources they need, the Secretary of State for Local Government has made it very clear that local authorities should approach him to make sure that we do everything we can to keep people safe, even in advance of getting that interim report from the inquiry.
I mean, one of the criticisms from Grenfell Fire, and if we look at the Lakanal House inquiry beforehand, in terms of looking ahead, people will say, why is it always poor people in social housing or housing associations that get affected?
Brawn House in my former council ward had a fire, but because it was from a time where the London Fire Brigade had more say over the regulations, that fire was contained within that one home, thankfully, and I think the London Fire Brigade need a greater role in this.
All right, let's leave it there. The Lib Dem conference is now underway. They didn't do as well as they might have liked in the recent election, winning only 3 seats in London. But now they've got a new leader, Sir Vince Cable, back from a 2-year sabbatical. What advice do senior party colleagues have for their new leader as he tries to claw back support in the capital?
It is absolutely essential that we retain London's position as the primary centre for financial business. It is very, very important, more important for London than perhaps other parts of the country, that we portray ourselves as an internationalist, outward-facing country. And the Liberal Democrats really are the only party who are saying that at the moment.
I think we have got the right messages on the issues of Brexit and the huge impact that's going to have on our hospitals, our public services, losing jobs from the city. But I think as the reality of Brexit creeps up on us, I think more and more people realise the Lib Dems are the only party who've had a consistent message on this, and I have no doubt we're going to see us gaining more votes and more seats in the years to come.
Well, earlier this week, Tanjil Rashid sat down with Vince Cable and began by asking him what went wrong with the party's performance in London.
Across the country, we didn't achieve our overall objectives. Our vote share wasn't as high as it should have been or will be in future. But, of course, we did win back seats, including mine and Kingston. We've got a massive upsurge in membership. We're looking forward to local government elections in London, where I think we will make significant headway.
But 2 general elections ago, you had 12 MPs in the capital. Now you have 3. What ideas do you have to win back the support of Londoners?
I think the political scene is shifting in a direction that will very strongly favour us as time goes on, and I think there are 2 main reasons for that. I think one is the whole Brexit argument. We're the only people who have consistently argued, as most Londoners do, that it's very much in Britain's interest to remain. I think the other issue is that British politics is becoming terribly polarised. You know, you have an extreme right-wing dominated hard Brexit Tory party, you have Labour Party hard left, though they run a very good election campaign for sure. And I think people will be looking for some sensible middle ground option.
But your pro-Remain stance didn't really go down that well in this pro-Remain city, increasing your vote share by 1% in the capital. So what other ideas do you have? I mean, you raised the spectre of property taxes in a recent speech. How do you think that's going to play with Londoners?
There is a massive issue in London that, you know, younger people can't afford to buy property, can't afford to rent. If you're serious about dealing with social injustice, you know, one has to deal with extreme inequalities of wealth.
So will you be resurrecting the mansion tax policy?
No, but what I did argue for was making the point that the council tax system is terribly unfair. A lot of people on middle incomes, for example, are paying far more council tax than they should be, and extremely valuable property not paying enough. So you do need a rebanding to make the system fairer.
Lib Dem leader Vince Cable. Ed Davey, you have 3 MPs in London. Why don't you appeal to Londoners anymore?
Well, I think we do appeal to a lot of Londoners, but in certain areas we just didn't manage to break through. I think you'll see, as you heard my colleagues talking about, our Brexit message will become increasingly popular as the damage that Brexit is going to do to the capital, to our public services, with health workers who are EU citizens having to leave and so on. I think people will realise that being part of Europe, yes, it's about our economy, about the city, but it's also about those things that people care about, their schools and their hospitals.
Yeah, but you didn't break through because people either didn't hear your message or they didn't like what you said. I mean, your pro-Remain strategy when it comes to Brexit is clearly not winning votes, is it?
Well, I think we went into the last election rather weak. Let's face it, we had a very bad 2015 election and we hadn't fully recovered. I think let's just be clear about that. But I think we are recovering, particularly under Vince now, and I think you will...
What evidence have you got for that recovery?
Well, let me give you an example. In the run-up to the 2017 election, we were winning local election results all over the country, including in London. And the Tories very cleverly called the general election before the local election. So that momentum that we were gathering didn't actually follow through, unfortunately.
Right. But they don't do things obviously to benefit the Liberal Democrats.
But of course not. But at grassroots level across the country, including London, we were building because we have a huge increase in membership. And I think our message is the relevant one for the future. Just because on one day, early this year, we didn't manage to break through, even though we were, I think, arguing a very strong message on Europe. I think more people will turn to that as time goes on.
Right, but, you know, Tim Farron said he was going to bet the farm on a Remain strategy. Well, he did, and it lost. I mean, this idea that you're going to somehow gain momentum with that same strategy does seem to be very risky. Is it time to change tack?
Let me be clear. I think if we were simply to talk about Brexit in Europe, then I think that would be a mistake.
Right.
And I think what we need to do, and Vince is already doing this, we need to talk about the economy. And as one of probably the Parliament's leading commentator on the economy, person who predicted the financial crisis, who developed an industrial strategy when he's in government, I think he gives us huge credibility on those bread and butter issues of jobs and people's incomes.
Right, except it's linked, of course, a lot of that strategy to Brexit. I mean, as you say, what else is the Liberal Democrat Party offering Londoners?
Well, you'll see whether it's on the environment or investment in schools, tackling the appalling police cuts that the Conservatives are putting on, which are leaving our streets, frankly, almost lawless. I think those sorts of issues we will really press home, and I think they will bring people to our colours.
Do you think taxing Londoners' property is the way to win votes in London?
Well, as you heard what Vince said, he thinks that there are a number of properties that are incredibly valuable, often not even owned by people from London, that are undertaxed. And there are a huge number of Londoners who can't get on the housing property market, who can't afford the rents, and you need a credible policy. And the idea you can do that with the money tree, you have to find that money from somewhere, and these very rich people in very high value properties are getting away with it.
But you admit it would hit the capital the hardest, wouldn't it, and therefore Londoners and votes?
No, it would actually help the capital the most, because if you get those resources from a relatively small number of very high value properties, they will be ploughed back into London. So a huge number of Londoners would be net gainers.
Right. I mean, is this a mansion tax?
Well, you heard Vince just now. It's about reforming council tax. And council tax, after it replaced the disastrous poll tax that the Conservatives had, retained a lot of the unfairnesses of the poll tax.
Sure.
And unless you reform it in the way by making those really valuable properties pay what they should do, you won't get the resources to tackle London's housing crisis.
I understand the motivation behind the policy, but is it a mansion tax or not that you are proposing?
You heard Vince, no.
Right. So how is it going to be different from a mansion tax?
Well, you heard Vince. I'm surprised, Joe, you're asking this question.
Just to make it clear for our viewers, I couldn't quite detect the clear difference between a mansion tax and a tax that is going to tax property.
Well, he talked about rebanding council tax and possibly having new bands on top of it. A mansion tax wasn't and isn't that.
Right. I mean, it is true, isn't it, that there are many properties that are under tax. Why shouldn't people be taxed more on their assets, on their wealth, rather than just their income?
Well, my concern about the Lib Dem proposals for new wealth and property taxes is that it will hit many people who may have relatively modest incomes and are living in a larger property.
Do you think there are more of those sorts of people than others in London who are and own very expensive and big properties and who just don't pay very much tax on them compared to people just below them, perhaps, in the council tax bands?
But it's obvious that any new tax on the family home is going to hit harder in London than it is elsewhere in the country. So the Lib Dem proposals are all about getting Londoners to pay more tax.
Getting a small number of Londoners who are very, very valuable, some of who don't even live in their homes.
What are the numbers we're talking about?
Well, we'll produce those when we have the final policy details. Vince is clearly working on them, but it won't be the sorts of figures that I think lie behind the criticism of Theresa, because the vast majority of Londoners will be beneficiaries of this policy.
Right. Is it something that you could support?
Well, the Manchester tax was in our 2015 manifesto, but
not in the 2017.
But I think Labour's manifesto this year committed to 1 million new homes to be built, including half council housing. And the idea that anyone will take any lessons from Ed Davey or Vince Cable on housing, when the Lib Dems with the Tories in coalition cut the funding for affordable housing, leaving areas like Southwark and
right. But are you in favour of a mansion tax policy or a rebanding, which is a very big job, of course, a rebanding of council tax?
I stood on a manifesto that supported in 2015, and
would you again?
Personally, I tested that in areas where people would be likely to pay it in my constituency, and those who would have been affected didn't generally raise it as a massive concern. So
right.
I think anything that helps rebalance housing would be very welcome.
Let's finish this discussion for now. Could these be the last days of Uber in the capital? In the next few days, Transport for London will announce whether they are going to renew the company's licence. Lawyers on all sides are poised and ready. So why might it be taken away? Andrew Cryan has this.
Since it launched 5 years ago in London, Uber has transformed the way we travel. With 3 million registered users in the capital, 40,000 drivers and 1 million journeys made every week. Do you ever use black cabs anymore?
Not so much.
When did you last get a black cab?
About 5 years ago.
It's far from a secret that black cab drivers aren't the biggest fans of Uber. The Licensed Taxi Drivers Association have for months threatened to contest any decision by TfL to renew Uber's licence in the courts.
Their business method, the way their app works, doesn't comply with the regulation. The regulation requires that a booking is taken by a licensed operator, they control the drivers, they send the drivers, and they're responsible. A simple glance at Uber's terms and conditions tells you it's nothing to do with us, we just introduce you to the driver. Completely outside of the 98 Act that governs private hire vehicles in London.
But Uber say that's not the case.
Every single journey booked through the app is a pre-booked job, exactly the same way that private hire has always operated. In the week that Sadiq Khan has announced the new Chief Digital Officer for London, we think that London has a record to be proud of demonstrating it is a home to innovation and a home to new technology, and Uber is part of that.
Another issue which was considered is whether Uber are, in the words of the law, fit and proper people to operate. This week, a group of MPs wrote to Transport for London, saying the company were not, listing reasons from their tax affairs to employment conditions and the number of sexual assaults.
We obviously disagree. I think the 3.5 million Londoners that use the product on a regular basis, there are 40,000 drivers who rely on the product to get work, and I think we filled a real gap in the transport system in London, and people really value that.
Other cities around the world have banned Uber, but in London, City Hall are very clear that any decision is going to be not the Mayor Sadiq Khan's, but a quasi-judicial one taken by Transport for London officers. However, according to Andrew Gilligan, who is Boris Johnson's cycling commissioner, the last mayor did personally consider whether to take the licence away.
This is inevitably a political decision. Sadiq was at pains to say it was a decision for TfL officials, which I take to mean the exact opposite. And how can it be otherwise? It's a hugely political decision, and he's going to be consulted at least on it, I'm sure.
City Hall strenuously deny that charge. But one certainty about this decision is that it may not be final, and will almost certainly end up being legally challenged and decided in the High Court.
Neil Kaur, you asked for Uber to lose their licence. You called for it this week. Why?
Lots of concerns. I mean, I'm on the Work and Pension Select Committee, and we've seen them there where, you know, looking through what some of the drivers end up with, as little as £2 an hour in some cases. Plus, we've seen the demand on the police not matched with the contribution to cover the DBS checks. But more worryingly, we've seen Uber fail to report sex attacks in their vehicle by their drivers to the police. They have dodged going to the police. They've raised it through TfL, which one police officer has indicated that if they had reported to the police directly, it could have prevented further attacks. Now, I think that makes Uber not fit and proper to be running a service in our capital.
Do you agree, Teresa?
I think I'd be reluctant to see Uber taken off the road altogether, but I think the renewal of the licence should be conditional on answering the kind of questions that Neil has quite rightly highlighted.
I mean, allegations of rape and sexual assault that aren't being actually answered by the company. Surely that does mean they're in breach of a fit and proper licence.
Well, that's obviously a legal matter for the Mayor and TfL to decide, but I am also conscious that Londoners value this facility, but I think Uber must reform to pay their drivers properly, give them decent terms and conditions. Uber needs to pay their taxes and they need to report crimes in the proper way.
Wouldn't that be the way to go? Rather than making 40,000 people unemployed, wouldn't it be better
but they're not
as Teresa...
Because Uber dodged employing them, so that it's not accurate to suggest that. And I think other operators would expand if Uber were not there. So I don't think that that's it's a fair accusation to say that people would be either losing a service or people would be losing jobs.
Well, they would be losing both. I mean, it's semantics to some extent, but if there were new conditions placed on Uber, strict conditions placed on them by Transport for London, and if the Mayor was to take a lead on this, would that not be a better solution than taking them off the road altogether?
I don't think we've ended up in this position because the Mayor and TfL haven't been asking Uber to do more and do better.
No, but they've got an opportunity here where their renewal is coming up.
They've been taken to court, they've been asked to improve, they have failed.
Right. Do you think they should come off the road?
I think temporarily, yes. Because I think they haven't proven and answered the questions that Neil and colleagues have been asking. I think above all it's passenger safety I worry about. Yes, the crimes, their failure to report crimes, which is quite outrageous actually, but also the number of collisions. We're seeing the collisions going up because they get their request for a passenger ride from Uber on their text. They have to answer within 10 seconds. And that's why you're seeing a number of accidents going up. And that is not good for the travelling public. I do want to see new technology applied. These new business models actually do offer choice. So we want to find a way. But I think we're going to need some national legislation on this. At the moment, if you're a train driver, a lorry driver, a coach driver, you're limited about the number of hours you can work. Not if you're a taxi or private vehicle hire. And because they're paid so little, they work for hours and hours and hours, which is dangerous to the public.
What about the demand from the public? I mean, it is clear that it is popular with certain people.
And to continue that point, some of the vehicles are on the road 24 hours a day. There's no way that one driver is operating. So someone else is in there who doesn't even have a licence. So people are being put at risk. That's what should be the priority. If they lose their licence, and I'd support TfL and the Mayor if that is the approach, then I think other platforms would come forward to suck up the customer base.
Right, so you want them to lose the licence, you want them to lose the licence temporarily.
Until these other things are put right.
And you would like the new regulations to come into play here?
Yes, I think if there is an extension of their licence, it should be temporary and it should be conditional on their dealing with these very, very serious questions raised on this programme.
Right, and how many of you use Uber?
I've never used Uber.
Ever?
No.
Teresa?
I do. I use both licensed taxi cabs and Uber.
And Neil,
I use the app to, not Uber, I use the Black Cab app to get black cabs wherever I am in London.
Right, OK.
I mostly use the train, actually.
Right, well, thank you. I was only asking about Uber, but thank you for filling us in with that vital piece of information. That's all we have time for. My thanks to Ed Davey, Teresa Villiers and to Neil Coyle.
I've been getting away with it.